is April 26th, and the City of Issaquah Equity Board meeting, we're calling the meeting to order.
Yes, it's 6:15. Yes, thank you.
And at this time, I will ask Monica, we will take attendance and see who all are present. Lorna Gilmore present.
Okay, we can do a roll call then. And next, Pretty.
Present.
Kelly.
Present.
Tony.
Present.
Present.
Good evening and welcome. And the other board members, Shay Fleming is running late. She will be here in person in a few minutes. And also Christina and Alisa will be joining us online in the next few minutes, but they are running late as well. And last but not least, Ray and Lucrecia are, they have an excused absence tonight. They're traveling, they're not available, but they will be back next week.
Okay, thank you very much, Monica. At this time, are there any public comments?
No one signed up for public comment, and we did not receive an email for the agenda for tonight.
Thank you very much, Monica. And right now, we will ask for the approval of the minutes from, we actually have two meetings of minutes for approval. So we'll start with the minutes of March 15, 2023, was a special meeting with the Human Services Commission and the Equity Board. Would anyone like to, let's take a few minutes and review the minutes before we can approve of the minutes.
And while you are reviewing the minutes, board members, I just want to make a note that we misspelled Christina's name on the March 15 minutes. We added an H to Christina, so we will make that small adjustment. The March 1st meetings are correct, at least for this time.
Now that people have had a few minutes to look over the minutes, are there any concerns or is there anyone? Do we approve of the minutes?
Looks like 60.
Yes, yes. Yes, I'm seeing 4 heads
Yes.
nodding to approve of the
Yes.
minutes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, we will approve the minutes from March 15th. And now let's look at the minutes for March 1st, and I'll give a couple minutes, a minute or two to just quickly look over that. Can I ask for the minutes to be approved? All in favor of the minutes being approved? A thumbs up from Kelly and Preeti in the room, and thumbs up from Tony on Zoom, and a thumbs up from Helen on Zoom. So we can go ahead and approve of those minutes. And we'll move on to the next agenda item on our list, which is a sustainable purchasing policy. And we have a guest speaker, David Reddy here, the sustainability coordinator in the city of Issaquah. Welcome, David.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. We've got a few slides for you tonight, and then some questions for general discussion at the end. But just to introduce myself, I'm David Reedy. I'm the new sustainability coordinator here at the city. I started in January, and I'm part of the two-person sustainability team. So the policy background, this is a policy that was called out as part of the Issaquah Climate Action Plan. And so when I started in January, this was handed to me as something that we could run with. And so right now we're really at this information gathering stage, planning for the actual writing of this policy, or the drafting of a first draft. And the sustainable purchasing policy really is centered around recognizing that the products and services that the city purchases inherently have social, environmental, and economic impacts, both at their time of purchase and throughout the life cycle of a project, a contract, or an item itself. And these, so sustainable purchasing policies have been around for quite a while. I put up a few example peer jurisdictions that do have similar policies, such as King County, Shoreline, Seattle. There are examples of sustainable purchasing policies from across the country and world. And kind of one interesting note is that most of these policies do happen in kind of larger jurisdictions like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco. But there are examples of smaller cities such as Shoreline who do have these. But so we're kind of in this process and in this information gathering stage. Part of the goal here is really thinking about what is right sizing a sustainable purchasing policy mean for us here at Issaquah who have fewer purchasing staff and you know, a little bit less resources maybe than a large city like Seattle. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we're really at the beginning of this process. And so right now I've been doing conversations with city departments throughout the city. So I've had talks to roughly 20 different folks in the city. I'm talking to some peer jurisdictions, and then I'm coming to you at the equity board and later in May to the environmental boards to get kind of feedback, really thinking around what it should look like for us here at the city of Issaquah and to kind of solicit some of that feedback before I do any writing to make sure that we are drafting the right policy for Issaquah. So on the slide right here, I have some examples of really what the sustainable purchasing policy might look like for the city of Issaquah and kind of what aspects might be included. And I have kind of printed out a whole list of examples from peer jurisdictions across the country of kind of what it really looks like for those. But it could include things like specific criteria to assess any purchase or contract or service that the city enters into to really think about, are we working with companies that minimize waste? Are we working with companies that are using local businesses? Are we making purchases that reduce energy use, etc.? And there's kind of a whole world of potential things that we can consider in our purchasing at the city. And so, yeah, so that's kind of some of the examples of really what might be included in this policy. And it really is, again, going to be mostly a guidance document to support city staff in making the right decisions as we all in the city make purchases throughout the year. Next slide. So this slide I included because it is quite important to kind of also note what the sustainable purchasing policy is not going to be. And really what these 3 points are trying to get at is recognizing that we're not going to impose a really rigid policy that doesn't recognize that there are changing circumstances or new knowledge and information about the impacts of our purchasing, right? So as an example, we can put into, if we had a rigid policy, there might be supply chain issues, which would then prevent the city from accessing materials or services. And so the idea is really to make sure that folks understand that we are hopefully putting together something that can change and adapt depending on staff needs, depending on community needs, and depending on new information around what is good, right, and the way we should move forward. Next slide.
Sorry.
So this is just kind of laying out the rough timeline of what we're looking at here. So we're in what I have called phase 1 very originally. And so this is outreach again to boards, to city departments, and some peer cities. And then soon, hopefully in June, I'm gonna actually draft a first draft of what this policy might look like for the city. My goal at that point, after drafting this policy, is to reach back out to the different city departments and connect again with those who are interested. I can, of course, come back to the equity board if that's of interest, to really, again, think about what we drafted, if it really is the right policy for Issaquah, if it addresses all of the issues and concerns that we want to see. And then in phase 4, we'll revise the policy and then work to get it implemented, working very closely with our finance team to make it implemented in the correct way. And there are a few options for that method. So we haven't exactly figured that out, but we're hoping to do this and get it adopted by the end of the year. And then we transition into the implementation phase of really thinking around supporting staff, ongoing past when this policy is adopted, to make sure that folks really understand and feel supported in implementing this policy. So next slide. So this is really my last slide, and I have kind of 3 questions here that I'm asking y'all and the environmental board as well. And again, this is really kind of just based around getting feedback before I draft the policy to make sure that we are considering the different elements and different perspectives in terms of what we should really be doing with our city purchasing. So we can do this in a few different ways, but first off, if there are any questions just generally about the sustainable purchasing policy, I'm happy to answer those, and then I would love to hear input on any of these questions as well.
What do you think the equity implications are for sustainability policy?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways it's been adopted into different jurisdictions. So I have kind of printed out different examples, but so they can range from things like trying to consider the human health impacts of materials and services purchased. But it also can go beyond to thinking about the business practices of organizations and companies that we're working with, right? So thinking, do they follow fair labor laws? Are we trying to work with minority women-owned businesses? Are we trying to work with small businesses? So there's kind of a wide range of what it could be. And so that is part of the reason of coming to this board, is to help me think about focusing that a little bit.
And I think that's where my question comes from, because I was at the fair.
Oh, great.
Sunday night, and noticed that the food truck did not have products that were acceptable. The city was busy trying to work with them and figure out how to help them. And I think what I was realizing is, even for us, it's hard, right? Because moving to all sustainable products, it can actually be very expensive. And so when you are a new business, especially a minority business or a small business, or a business that just doesn't have as much money and is trying to start up, how do we support those small businesses as well as maintain the environment? Because when you're struggling to just make ends meet, sometimes it's easy to buy products that are cheaper rather than going into the ones that are more sustainable.
Mhm.
And so is there any kind of plan or support that the city, because she was very sweet, I can't remember your person in charge.
Stacy, yes.
And she was getting all the forks that the city has and using that. But is that something that can be done more? And like, how do we, so I think my main thing is, I would love to see that kind of partnership continue and grow, because I need a small business. But how do we support that small business?
Mhm.
Because in my view, a lot of those small businesses that I see are usually either minority owned or women owned or just small. So I just want to make sure that we're not losing those people who are trying to make ends meet by now excluding them from the race of getting on contracts or working with the city because they can't afford it.
And what were you referencing? You were referencing something as a sustainability fair?
Oh, there was a food truck out there to, hopefully, because the fair was from 10 to 2.
Uh-huh.
So they were just having food and they had aluminum, foil and plastic forks. And it was very much,
At the sustainability.
they were
fair.
asked to add that because the whole point was to
Yeah.
show that you can do
Yeah.
compostable
Yeah.
items, right?
No, that's a great point, and I think that is an important part of any policy that we are putting together, in that, you know, we're going to be asking staff to kind of be holding many different
Yeah,
ideas and criteria and perspectives all together when they're making purchasing,
Yeah,
right?
because when I noticed that for the city, they were very considerate of themselves, hey, if it's too expensive and we cannot do it, then we're giving ourselves an out. But it's not that I want to give people an out, but I want to give businesses an opportunity to be able to get into the game of, you know, having contracts and not penalizing them because they don't have materials and supplies to collect or like to work with the city.
Right. So what I'm hearing is making sure that we don't use this policy to then exclude smaller businesses that may or
Yes.
that may or may not kind of have these.
And it's not that I want them to use plastic forks,
Of
whatever.
course.
Or how can, it's not that we want to pay for it, but is there some kind of grant or money or incentive to support those businesses to get supplies so that they can be competitive in this? Because I would like to see everyone at the, you know, the Saturday market not be using plastic in my perfect world. But how do we make sure that that's happening and not exclude vendors from coming and participating, because they really could use that income.
Tony?
Yes, thank you. So with regard to the RFP process, are you willing to take maybe suggestions and input from the equity board in that process as well? And a second part question to that is, how when the city is actually soliciting for requests for proposals, is it just I don't know, I want to say an advertisement in particular forms, or how does that get out to the relevant entities? I mean, back in the day, it was usually in the newspaper. So how's that inputted right now?
Yeah, great question. So I would say I'll address the second question first.
Okay.
And the reason I'll do that is because I don't really know. And I think part of that is because there's a lot of these efforts aren't centralized at the city, partially because we lack the really robust purchasing departments that some cities have. And so I think different departments do it in different ways, right? And so when we think about the implementation of this policy down the line, there is going to be these opportunities of how do we think about how to share RFPs and those items in different ways that can then reach maybe wider businesses, more diverse businesses, et cetera.
Right.
And then when it comes,
When you're done, I can speak a little bit because I'm a different department and we
Yes.
issue RFPs, and I can add to that a little bit.
And I was eyeballing because I was like, I can probably add to that too. So, yeah,
absolutely,
okay.
yes, we have different experts in the room. When it
Cool.
comes to equity board input into the RFP process, I believe the answer will be yes, if you want to have some of that eyes on at least some template language. I can't promise necessarily on all RFPs or anything, but as part of the implementation of this process, we are hoping to build out some template language that can be included in contracts and RFPs around environmental responsibility as well as equity and some of these social considerations for companies so that for many reasons, and partially so that we can try and make sure that the organizations that we're working with are following some of these practices. So if that is something that is of interest to the equity board, as we develop those templates, and I imagine that will come after the adoption of this policy, I'd be more than happy to bring things back to you all.
Yes.
Fantastic.
And then a few things on the RFP process, Tony, that I would love to chime in. David was absolutely right. There are multiple types of RFPs because there are multiple departments, right? So while there is kind of like a coordinated tool where different companies can go and sign up so they can receive RFPs, it really depends on the domain, right? Like, for example, public works, if they're looking for a construction contractor, they're going to go into a different set of where they're going to issue that RFP compared to, let's say, if our human resources department is looking for an equity consultant, that's a different domain. Or whereas human services, we issue the RFPs for the human services grants. Again, we are just looking, so that's why there are different things, and there cannot be a coordinated because it's just super, super large. However, I can also tell you from working in the past 2 years, just on the human services RFPs, there was a large body of work done from not only the content of the RFP, the language, and how easily translated that could be, also to what you just said, how do we share that information to make sure that it gets to the right people? How do we even offer technical assistance during the RFP process? How do we worked also on like creating questions that don't exclude certain groups and smaller nonprofit agencies. It's when you dive deeper, there are just so many steps at every level of the RFP process, not to mention even after like you issue the RFP and how do you then review the RFP, then a whole set of new equity issues. So it's fascinating and complex at the same time.
It's very complex. I'm learning a lot in this process.
And I'll add a layer to the onion. If you actually go to our city website, I was just pulling it up so I could direct you. We actually have a webpage on bids, RFPs, and RFQs, and we actually use a public purchase forum. So this largely is geared towards public works, but there is a shared procurement portal and process for RFPs. I know, I have had very few RFPs in, say, HR as an internal service, but when I have had them, we do have a resource in our administrative services department that handles RFPs all the time and can put it out on this shared public purchase portal. So we've got a lot of miscellaneous things going, but there is certainly, to answer your question, an opportunity, to really look at structuring an equitable way in which we do it, depending upon the business that we're seeking in RFP. So I think that piece, it kind of plays into, equity framework and what we're going to do citywide in a great way. And I think it's an area that we need to talk about citywide.
Absolutely.
Okay. I do have a follow-up, if you don't mind, to everything that was talked about. So would you say, would the three of you say that the current RFP process is more of a, I guess I would say, a build it and they will come approach, meaning the build it is the RFP, it goes out in the public forum, they will come, as in terms of the vendors, will come in based on them being, let's say, registered, so to speak, for in the system. There's no outreach to, let's say, certain business organizations, whether it be the minority business organization. I don't know if there's one in Issaquah. I know there's one in Seattle, but like outreach to there to like, hey, sign up for our portal, blah, blah, blah. There's no outreach.
There is,
There
for
is.
human services, there is, and I'm sure there is for others, like even like with human services grants, for example, if you remember, we are on a 2-year cycle. This is the year for us to do outreach, and early next year, we'll do more outreach to even just let people know that this is coming, right? And then just like build up, like this is the year where we want to work with smaller organizations to build up that capacity.
And I think
But-
that,
yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead.
I think that speaks to kind of some of our earlier points and Monica and Stephanie's points around there are different processes at the city. And so as Stephanie mentioned, there's some kind of centralized efforts and there is support within the city to actually build these RFPs, right? We're not starting from scratch, but in my conversations with departments across the city, I think one thing that I can say is that different departments do things differently, right? Monica has mentioned all the work that Human Services has put into kind of thinking about this process. And there are other departments that are really kind of thinking about this, and some departments are thinking about it more from environmental criteria, waste reduction, et cetera. And then there are departments where this has not really come up yet. And part of that is because they might not think about it as much. And then also some of it is just that different departments have different regulations and laws around how they procure and what they should procure. So it gets a little bit, each department is a little different. Each department has approached it differently. And part of this process is really to try and bring folks together and help infuse these processes throughout the city with kind of these equity perspectives and frameworks, as well as the environmental frameworks as well.
And it's really, I think, both, Tony. It's put it out and see what you get in, but also advertise and seek, maybe who you know that you'd like to get a potential application from. So I've done the approach of both. Who I know, but who do I not know and who am I not getting to? I'm relying more on the public side than the direct invitation to apply.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, so I was looking at the questions you have up on the screen, and I'm thinking about from my experience, you've mentioned environmental, social, economic impact and cost. And so those things are often, I think, as Lorna was describing, like they're in tension with each other. So I think as you're developing, a policy or guidance, there should be something that helps people who are using that document prioritize, and think about, because, when I think about if it's decentralized, you have different agencies, and I think oftentimes the immediate concern becomes the budget. So they want to go, what's the cheapest thing, right? So, and if they're trying to work within a budget, they're going to most likely try to prioritize cost over everything else. So how can you pull those sustainability, environmental goals, those social goals, equity goals in balance with the cost? Because cost seems to be driving decisions a lot. So I think some sort of decision-making matrix around that could be really, really helpful. And because we know like the true cost of something is not the price tag. So what is that long-term cost to the environment, to our, equity goals, to our values? So I think the more you can kind of get tactical and how folks can make decisions that pull those other things in balance, that would be really helpful.
That's a great point. Thank you for that.
And I just wanted to ask, in terms of compliance, what the current process might be and how you all will continue to help vendors remain in compliance. Because I notice a lot of times it's just, they'll start in compliance and then they drift based on cost, based on, changes in the economy, that kind of thing. So is there a plan kind of set forth in that inherently, or is there a review process that we can expect to see?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think I am not super familiar with a ton of compliance efforts right now. And that's not to say they don't exist at the city, but that is just something that I'm less familiar with. And I think generally the sustainable purchasing policy, since it'll be more based on guidance, is not gonna have a whole lot of compliance teeth to it. That being said, especially if we can work to build things into RFPs and contracts and kind of that broader set of efforts, then there will be the idea and the hope would be there would be the opportunity to say, you know, you as a company who entered into a contract with us, you know, we have language in this contract in the RFP process that said that you are going to comply with these things and you're no longer doing that, or that you value these things and you're not doing that. And so it allows, hopefully the idea would be that it would give staff the ability to then go back to the table with companies and say, this is something that you committed to and that we're not seeing it anymore. And so I am not so familiar with any other power we would have in that situation, but that is something that I can look at for sure.
Thank you.
And I apologize for typing at the same time.
No,
but-
no.
I didn't know you guys had music entertaining at your meetings. Oh, okay.
Are they just open later right now? Yeah, as the summer months come along, they start to stay open a little later, because they get more daylight, so.
Or they're outside more, I think, in the
Yeah.
past, but they're indoor and you don't hear them as much.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I'd love to make time for the other presentations.
Oh, just one other
Yes.
comment. You know, I was looking at the phases you had listed, and so I know, like, after implementation, are you planning to kind of revisit and see how folks have been doing with respect to following your guidance, to see if there's to improve upon it and to maybe not give it teeth, but to have
Yeah.
it be followed a little bit more?
Yes, that's a great question, and I think that's kind of one of the more complicated aspects that I'm currently working on is, right, we'll have this policy and then kind of that big step that we're thinking about at the same time is really this implementation of is with our main purchasing specialist, Natalie, and then also Dale, our management analyst. I don't know if she's come to y'all before, but in terms of thinking about how do we measure success for this policy. There are going to be some things we can do and some things we can't, right? I am not going to go through every single P-card purchase that everybody at the city makes to make sure that they bought recyclable cups or, you know, whatever it might be. However, we are trying to think about perhaps a system of looking at contracts every once in a while and kind of or something to really kind of better understand how are staff implementing this policy and how is it getting put into their everyday decision making. And another piece of this is, since this will be more guidance versus very specific requirements for staff, a big part of this is really just focused on staff commitment to it, right? And so we're only going to succeed with this policy if staff throughout the organization, throughout the city, are committed to pursuing social and environmental and equity considerations into their purchasing. And so this is going to be a long process after implementation, and we're really kind of trying to think out right now what that measurement and metric and reporting out is going to look like. So nothing concrete on that right now, but we are working on it. And if you have any suggestions, I'm more than happy to listen to them.
I think the work you're doing is fantastic. I think that this is like incredible that Issaquah is even adopting and staffing it. I think that it's really important to tell the community that Issaquah is unique in this and that we're doing this. I think that People really right now want to hear good stuff, and this is really good. And I also think that internally, you should have that same mentality, which you probably do, you just bring it here. But like give awards to, I mean, like Issaquah gets awards for their sustainability work that they're recognized for, and the community, I can say it because it interests me, right? I can't name the award, but I can name what it's for, what they did, it got it for, right? And that is, so apply for awards, give awards, because it's just, we're all craving positive, at least that's me.
It's the Ruth something, or
The Ruth and Dan Keys Award is the one that was recent.
they were last week, or right, or.
Yeah,
Yeah.
last week, last Monday.
Oh, see, I don't even know about that one. I'm that other one.
Yeah.
Well, spread it. Why?
Yeah.
That one's an every 2-year one.
Yeah, yeah.
Tony.
Sorry for all the questions, but I do have one more. So I was wondering in terms of policy, in terms of like, the RFPs and the RFQs that go out, is it possible in the future, and I'm not talking near future, I'm probably talking maybe far future, to have within the communication in that RFP to have something such as a policy of, preference given to vendors or businesses who meet our City of Issaquah equity framework, such as maybe in that framework being companies who may be committed to diversity in their hiring practices, as well as companies who are minority owned. But basically, because we espouse to be a city that cares about equity, that wants to put an equity lens on everything that we do. And so I think a policy like that, if it's not already employed, I would love to see that done in the future if it can be.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. That is something we're looking at. I can't say yes, specifically yes or no right now. And I think there are, again, for different RFPs, different requirements on what we can and cannot do legally. But
Right.
it is a conversation that we are actively talking about with folks internally about really what we can do preference wise and what we can do in terms of really trying to encourage city staff to make some of these decisions. So that is
Right, of
a
course.
great point, and I have it noted down as something that we can as something that I can kind of try and push forward.
And I think it's a really good tee up too to what we're gonna talk about, kind of work plan and update on internal stuff. I think that we can address too.
Any last comments?
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having me. This is fun.
Thank you for being here.
I can vouch for the sustainability team. I put on an all-city event in March, and afterwards I got the, hey, Stephanie, some of the purchasing that we did for that, can we connect on, some of these, things that are more sustainable? And I said, absolutely. So they do a really fabulous job, just watching from all lenses, so.
The city is doing an amazing job. Like I was at the March event and also the fair, and I'm very impressed and happy to be proud to be part of this club.
That's great. We're trying to push things forward as much as we can. So, and we can only do so much with the support of boards and commissions and residents. So, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you all
Thank
for having me.
Thank you.
And
Go enjoy that sun.
I think I probably will actually.
thank you. Quick check with folks online. Can you see us and hear as well? I know Christina was on there for a moment and then we lost her. I'm wondering if she's okay. And Helen and Tony.
Oh, yep. Loud and
can
clear.
you
Loud
hear
and clear.
us
I
and
can see you
us?
too. Yeah. I'm good on my end. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, again, we cannot see you on the screens.
Oh, yeah. I
I
turned my camera off because I was drinking my smoothie.
Thank you. And the interpreter's checking in. Are you in contact with Christina? Yes, you are. Oh, she's over the phone? Okay, she's interpreting. Okay. Okay, the interpreters are interpreting for Christina. I think that's what I am interpreting from what Hillary is telling me on the screen. And if I'm not correct, then I'm not sure. But yes, okay. So Lorna, you can
Do you want me to
continue.
continue or do you want Shay to continue?
It's whatever you
No,
decide.
yeah, you're fine. I'm sure you
Okay.
did great, so.
Thank you. Well, that was a great presentation from David. And now we shall move on to presentation by Stephanie Johnson from the Human Resources Director regarding the equity framework implementation. And that was some other equity updates. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Lorna. It's good to see you all. I haven't seen you in a while, so thank you for having me. I would not say I have a presentation per se, but I want to have a conversation. I want to give you an update on where we're at, and then I hope you'll give us some input as we advance forward. So, as you know, we have worked together a tiny bit at one point in bringing some training to this team on an equity framework, and then you took that framework and to council. Preeti and I did that. It was actually June of last year. And then council had said, okay, well, go pilot it and bring us feedback back. One of the things I want to candidly share is the staffing constraints of 2022. I think all of us could probably turn on the news and see it was the year of the great resignation, and I heard someone say the great job swap as well. And so one of the things I want to tell you over the last year is resource allocation in the city. We've been working very hard to staff positions all throughout the city. Since January of last year, we have made 138 hires or promotions. We are an FTE count of 275, so that is half our workforce. So that presented a bit of a challenge for us in terms of training and advancing the equity framework when we were working so very hard to fill many vacancies in the city and just get the staffing up to speed. I will tell you, as of today, we're looking really good in terms of citywide staffing. We have roughly 20 positions left open at a time where that was 50 plus, you know, that was a little shaky, but one of the things that we've really, struggled with a little bit is resource allocation, wanting to advance so much around equity, but then even just having the internal resources to be able to do that. I have been having a lot of conversation with City Administrator Bob Kowitz about how to ensure that we do have resources to advance this work. And so you look to other communities, and some have hired a chief equity officer. The city administrator and I've been talking a lot about, while we need resource for somebody to really facilitate and carry this work on, we didn't want it to be a one-person responsibility. We really wanted it to be the responsibility of everyone in the city, although we do need somebody to pick up the pieces and carry it forward. So having said that, I was authorized FTE overhire in HR. Even since January 1, I have 3 new staff members in HR. One started Monday, actually, so I have a really fresh 3rd day person. But that is meant to give a space that I personally will be taking a greater role in advancing equity in the city. And so I, as of the last couple of weeks, have been assigning, I have a really great labor relations manager in the HR department. And to help her own growth and development, I have been working to train the new staff and hand off some of that day-to-day HR operation so that I can go out in the city and advance equity in a greater way. So I wanted to give you a staffing update because it really speaks to kind of the overall picture where I really would have hoped, I have this list of all the accomplishments that we've made internally. And I do have a few. I do not want you to think that things have been sitting idle, but I do think that our staffing picture plays certainly a role in our ability to carry out, much of what we've wanted to do. I will also tell you that I gave in a staff report a very similar update to the city council on March 20th to talk about the staffing constraints, to make the council aware that we have overhired in HR to create a space to advance this Q2 and forward. So if you are interested, we can link that. I don't. Depends on if you're very connected to the council calendar or not. We will make sure you have that resource. Very similar update and commitment to the council that we're advancing this work. But in that report, one of the things I do want to share is that even though we maybe have not been able to advance all that we have wanted to the level that we have, I am very happy to report that we just pulled our metrics from that recruitment efforts. And over the last year, the efforts that we have made in advancing our diversity in hiring, our racial diversity has increased by 6% this last year. And so, that is really a great thing that I get to report. While we maybe didn't get, some of the framework advanced as much as we have wanted, the staff that we are putting in place to help us do that going forward is certainly creating a dynamic for us to do that. One of the things over the last year also, with all that new hiring, we have now embedded over the last year that as a part of the onboarding process for new hires, that they receive 4 DEI trainings that they are required to complete in their first 90 days. You maybe all remember that we talked about this. It's been a year ago. I think I even gave you the opportunity to try the trainings. So the 4 are, preventing discrimination and harassment. There's an extended 15-minute piece for responsibility of supervisors, covering unconscious bias, workplace diversity, inclusion, and racial sensitivity, and microaggressions in the workplace. So all the hiring that we have done, all those new hires have received at least that baseline training so that we are, using some same language and understanding the city's commitment to DEI work. We also do Qua 101, we call it. When you come on board and you're a new hire, it's all about getting you on payroll and you selecting your benefits, and then you do these trainings. Well, sometime in the next quarter after you're hired, we invite you to what we call Qua 101. And in there, we talk about all of our committees and the ways that you can get involved. And, we're certainly pitching being a part of the equity committee in a greater way to all of our new hires as well. David is a perfect example of that. He mentioned in his presentation that he was hired in January. He raised his hand in the last couple of weeks, actually, and said, I'd love to come join. And we started talking about both of us being here today. And, he's a really good example of making that communication flow to our new hires to understand how we want to advance this work. The other thing that, you know, you all certainly, had a huge piece in is the, you know, the city council's adoption of the cultural and religious calendar. So, you know, we've been using that internally. My department is responsible for all citywide communications. And so we are trying to, you know, educate on the cultural and religious calendar. This last month, or April, the month I guess we're still in, you know, we did additional communication on Passover and Ramadan internally so that our, you know, our staff are just getting used to learning more about what you all are doing, you know, as well, and what we're celebrating in the community. So while we have some work to do to advance the equity framework, and gonna pick that up in a really great way. It does not mean everything is sat, but the staffing changes and pieces have certainly been a piece of restriction from being able to do that in a meaningful way. So, going forward, I'm talking a little bit about a look back, but I'd rather talk about what we're gonna do going forward. So the Internal Equity Committee met in January and then took a little bit of a hiatus in February, March, just because of staffing constraints in Q1 and getting people up to speed. We just met last week and we are scheduling a retreat. We did a doodle poll and that retreat is scheduled for May 26th. So we are gonna go semi-off-site and spend a half day and really dive into our work plan in a greater way, and determine, you know, how we're going to advance the equity framework, but the other items that we need to achieve as well. At last week's meeting, I surfaced and shared your work plan, the equity board's work plan. There were two particular things that you identified that you might like to work with either. I mean, I know police is involved with at least one of them, but how we fit together and how that parallels or comports is certainly something that I don't want to lose sight of as we build our work plan internally and you have your work plan, so that we're on the same mission. So you're exploring bias and privilege through data in city departments and reporting biases. I certainly am not losing sight of that when we do talk about work plan on the internal equity side so that we can, you know, make sure we're all rowing in the same direction. And if the left or right hand is expecting the other one, that we're able to be there, you know, for each other. So, so that's coming up in May. I will tell you, as much as I want to use the equity committee to help with the equity framework training, I'm already starting to do my own formulation of being able to advance that in a greater way. One of the things that I want you to know is that SLT, the senior leadership team, is made up of all the directors and a few other division managers in the city. And we meet every Tuesday at 10 a.m. And City Administrator Bob Kowitz, you know, has been continuously saying to the team, we, the senior leadership team, need to ensure that we are, you know, we're the change champions. And so we need to be working through piloting this framework so that we can then expect it within our departments. So the senior leadership team selected two projects to put the equity framework to use on. One is a dog park project, which is located just ironically in this, like we're in this room. I'm internal services, so don't ask me what that address is, but yeah, the dog park project. And then the economic development plan at Jen Davis Hayes. So we've asked Jen Davis Days and Jeff Watling to each, you know, they have all the knowledge about those projects, right? And so we've asked them to come to SLT explain, in great detail what the projects are to SLT, and then pilot the framework and then come to SLT and talk to us about, lessons learned with this. I will tell you right off the get-go, I will be very transparent. The number one feedback item that I've received is the amount of the questions. 13 of them, and not just that, and I don't have it pulled up here, but things like, what does this mean? Or do we even have data for me to answer this question, right? This framework puts you in a mindset, and I think it's achieving those things. But I'm really rethinking a little bit, and will want to work with you all about dwindling that down a bit from 13 and starting a little smaller, just so that we get used to using something in the city. I also am not remiss in that we had staff attend or do these Treliant trainings, and then we had them attend deconstructing our bias conversations that we use Chan and Kelly Ray for. And then we've had no after conversation about it. And I feel like that after conversation is really, really, really important. And so my approach to this is thinking about those things. Also, the fact that I'm not convinced that internally all the staff even know the demographic makeup of the city, to maybe even understand what, maybe even education on a marginalized group. I know you had that feedback, at the council meeting to say, hey, when we're doing this equity training, we also need to talk about what is a marginalized group, so my approach to structuring the next training is going to be small group conversations. We can resurface what individuals have learned. Some went through those trainings in the beginning of 2021, right? Others have it fresh. But that we do some small group conversations. We talk about what we learned. We talk about the demographic of Issaquah, and we start to pilot a framework, maybe using just 3-5 questions. I will say, if you all remember when we came out to you to say, hey, we want to advance an equity framework, some of you had used a framework often and a lot, and others hadn't, hadn't. And we said, let's start with training, right? So I think, council did that. You all had the opportunity to do that. We need to have those small spaces internally to be able to do that, because if we just say, here's a framework and want everybody to use it, I'm just not convinced we're gonna maybe hit the mark in the way that we want to be very effective.
Stephanie, without Shannon, I'm sorry, I can't remember the middle name, who has been doing follow-up work? Because that framework was quite robust, and it did need ongoing reminders and points on how to use it. So who's been working with you on that kind of training?
That we do not have an external equity consultant right now, and that's going to be that approach that I'm talking about HR actually, pivoting a little bit to reporting somebody else so that I can dedicate time and work with a consultant if we need it. But nobody has been taking that framework and doing that follow-up to the degree we need it to and we want it to.
And what is your plan? I mean, I hear that you're saying you're going to pivot, but what does that mean? Are you looking at hiring a new consultant? What's your time frame?
Yeah, so I personally am going to start with these small group training sessions internally in the city. And we are gonna pilot something very simple, like maybe a HR example, and then work with I'm gonna work with department directors to identify a subject that is relevant for that department or work team. So I personally am going to be doing that. And then if we need to build upon that, then we would bring in help. We've got to start with even just some conversation in the organization.
So like, what would be an example of a workplace scenario that someone would bring in?
Yeah, so, it kind of depends on department, right? And so, certainly not because I am HR, but I think we can all relate to HR related things, right? A hiring practice or something of that nature. I think that could be a very universal example across the city, especially because everybody in the city has been recruiting to the level that they have, right? But then department specific may be, you all did an arts, I think a public art example, right? There could be, I was talking with, Public Works, they have a couple of policies, that, potentially, certainly around transportation. I wanna, there's so much that could be, done. We've got to start small, right? And so I don't want to necessarily bite off, some big CIP project without us taking a low hanging fruit item for us to even try the framework out. So it could be, David here talked about, purchasing. And so we could certainly take an approach with, a purchasing item. CIP, you are gonna all hear CIP presentation next week. And so I met with Robert to say, how do we use this framework within
That's
the,
what CIP is.
oh, capital improvement plan. Yeah,
I have a different
acronym.
use for
Yeah,
CIP.
yeah. Oh,
There are questions online.
Tony, sorry, I was, sorry.
That's okay. No, I have a couple of questions, and thank you. First of all, let me say thank you very much for sharing with us those data points, facts. That's really, really great to hear. Um, but my question is in relation to, I guess, the psychology, because I kind of work in organizational change work. Part of what I do is change management. But with that, would you say that the framework in, it sounds like that there's pushback. Did you see that pushback as being that the framework is too much, or is it that it's worthless?
No, I definitely don't think people think it's worthless. I think that our organization isn't used to really, certain pockets of the organization isn't used to using anything. So how do we approach this? I think it's the approach. And
Okay.
then the dedicated space to be able, to have training time and requirement and expectation that we do this, right? There's definitely commitment, at the administration level that it is required work. And this might be difficult conversations. And I'll be honest with you, there's probably pockets of the organization that say, we don't have an issue here in Issaquah. Why are we advancing some of this work? And it's not about problem per se, it's about knowledge that we need to even give to the internal staff, at some level. So it's been time. It's certainly been the time with the new staffing to be able to get out there and do it in a meaningful way. To answer your question, Kelly, too, about projects, people are still needing to formulate what is something I would use this on? Is it anything? Is it everything? What are you looking for? What are those low hanging fruit things? And so, certainly any policy we develop in the city, different departments are doing different policies. Council too, I think, is asking staff more questions. Has this been through, an equity framework? One thing I want to say too, I said to Monica today earlier as everyone was gathering, I said, what's kind of interesting to me as we approach this work. I really am feeling like as you all are growing as a board, some of our staff are actually using you like a framework, right? You are actually kind of a pseudo framework in some way, coming out to ask you questions. And we gotta figure out how that fits into this too, right? What do we need to do internally before we bring something to the equity board? What should we have baked? What do you all wanna see? And, I wanna tell you kind of our approach, but I wanna pivot this too, to what would success look like for you, me sitting here, in a month, in 3 months, in 6 months, in a year, that we've advanced internally. And I want to make sure that that is well represented with what we are doing internally.
I think I'm kind of still stuck on the framework, because I think when we did the framework, it was a little bit easier for us because they were things that we automatically already address and consider. So I don't know if it was really seen as 13 questions with so much to think about, because it was, I think, designed to make sure that assumptions and biases, because the whole point is to start dismantling institutional racism, right?
Mhm.
And so you're talking about the fact that some people didn't even think that there was a problem when this is needed. And so I think we were trying to be very deliberate in making sure that all of many different questions were being asked and people are really having a robust thinking, like really pushing them to think beyond their normal thoughts and perceptions as to what this project, what this plan, what this investment could do for the public. So I think for me, in 6 to 12 months, what I'd like to see is, I don't think it's actually gonna happen in 6 months or even 12 months, to be honest. But I'd like to see that there's less pushback, that people are automatically internalizing some of those questions like we kind of did when we did our training. Because when we did our training, I don't know if anyone in this group really thought, oh my goodness, this is so robust. Like a lot of the questions were already done in our conversation and discussion. So I would love to go back to that, because I feel like they're coming in and it's very checkboxy, which again goes back against the whole concept of equity.
Right.
Because now you're going to check equity, and so I think it's concerning me, I think, because it feels like, no, but I think that
No, that's
people will say that this is checkworthy, because you're talking about like, oh, there's, it feels like there are some people concerned about having to really go through the 13 questions, when really we're asking them to really internalize those 13 questions and consider that not as check, rather than here are all the things we should have considered. Maybe this is not a factor, but we want to really give it some thought. And so I really want to make sure people are slowing down rather than saying, let's, throw out some questions, like stay in that.
Yeah.
And really give it some time to make sure it works, because that's the whole point, because otherwise we're not really doing it with fidelity. And really it loses the value if we're going to say, well, this question is silly, like who makes those decisions? I honestly don't remember us thinking that any of the questions were not valuable, but I also remember us feeling like these are automatic questions a group of very diverse individuals would have considered anyway.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense to the rest of my.
Yeah, it did.
So if I could, I think, I've heard like Tony and Lorna speak, and so I think that there's this over attention on the equity framework itself, because it is a tool. And I think, as Lorna said, the tool is not hard to apply if you understand the foundational concepts underneath it. And that's where I think that it sits within this larger organizational transformation that has to happen.
Yeah.
In terms of, so when I think about equity, so I think about a deep equity framework, and you could Google it, but it starts with like internal learning. People have to truly understand what racism is, how it flows and impacts everyone's lives. They have to also understand how interpersonally they show up, what power and privilege they have, and how they interact with colleagues. Then there's this organizational layer around policy and practice and implementation, and then systems and how our work impacts others. And so the tool, the equity tool, is really kind of situated in that organizational and systemic layer of work. But it's hard to apply it if you don't have a good foundational understanding about what equity is, racism, and so I think some of that understanding, that call to action, is almost like a requirement that leadership needs to set the tone, like you said, SLT. So leadership really has to come out with a clear stance on what equity is about, anti-racism, and then put some understanding, common foundational understanding in place for how people show up in the culture as well as in the work. So I think that maybe that jumping to the framework might be a little hard, but I think there's also impatience because we know racism impacts people on their daily lives. So that's another tension to hold in balance. But I think this is a tool. So I think that it's hard to apply the tool easily, like Lorna said. I think if folks understand what the true work is, it's easier to apply the tool. So this could be a sticking point in terms of the readiness to adopt the tool.
Yeah. Thank you both, and well, let's hear
There's
some more,
also
and then I wanna.
here was
Okay.
person.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because there are a lot of points that you brought up with regard to the board that I thought were important because we're looking at, I wanted to know if there were some specific questions that kind of stuck out that people automatically brought up that were hard. And I'm not sure if you can answer on this platform or not, but if we could maybe look at what people are considering too hard to answer because they don't have the data to answer it, maybe we can help them figure out how to look at that information.
Yeah.
Because to Lorna's point, we did put this together in a very concise way that wasn't designed to have a box checked. On the other side of that coin, I wanted to also consider maybe there's a possibility we could look at specific questions for specific groups. Not every single question that may not apply to every single group. And that's not to say that there are some that are important and some that aren't, but if people are worried about the sheer number and how they apply all those questions, it's possible that some of those questions don't necessarily need to be applied to them. And it's always hard to say which ones are and which ones are, but that's something that we could possibly look at in order to kind of meet some of that readiness that people are struggling with. And then lastly, when an organization has decided that they have reviewed all these questions, I think that's the time when we should have them come in front of the board and have them kind of express what they've understood from the framework. And if we can see that they haven't quite understood it, then maybe that's a point where we can be of more use. And I'm not saying that they should be checking boxes, but I definitely think that there are questions that people will say, oh, well, that doesn't apply to us, so we're not gonna worry about that. In which case, we may be the eyes that point that out. So in a lot of senses, that may also help them internalize some of those questions. And if they've discovered that they haven't, then we can say, okay, this is why this question is important to you. And maybe you should consider these factors. Because as Lauren said, a lot of us are already involved in this work, even in our businesses. So it may be a good idea for them to review the framework, semi-answer the questions, and then give us an opportunity to review how they've chosen to answer them.
Okay.
I think we had Helen and Tony online. Thank you so much.
Helen, if you want to go first, I know I think you had your hand up. So if you want to go first, I'll ask mine after you.
All right, I did, and then Shay sort of pointed to my question, which was really if the questions, the 13, and bringing them down to a certain number. I think, again, back to Pretty's point, it's an internal work, and if there is even a thought of cutting back the number of questions, then it's attempting to think through it should not take a long time. I guess it's the apprehension is maybe difficult. It's one of those difficult spaces, which is the purpose of this activity anyway, to get people uncomfortable, to welcome the thought process of change.
Right.
And my thought also would be on the recent hiring. If there's a marker on 6% increase, what do the rest of the team think about it? Is that one of probably something you could point to them? Did they think through it? It might be visual, like you can see that, oh, there's been an increase in diversity in these hires. But over time, will there be a change or a positive impact in those hires that then points the team towards appreciating? You use that sort of like your pilot project to sell equity framework and the thought process, whilst it might be very obvious because it's HR and it's hiring and it's visible. It will give a good look to people outside to see, oh yeah, there is diversity and there's a thought process. But there are other layers to that with other parts of the city work that might not be visual, but are important in impact. So then you have that as sort of a baseline to get them to get uncomfortable with all the 13 questions, regardless of how long it takes, because I think the point is to get uncomfortable with the thoughts and whatever apprehensions they might have, to get them to then dig in the years to come. This is not a work that's going to take 2 days. We all know that. So they might as well fasten their seatbelts, all of us for that matter, attend to it however long it takes, even though we might feel the pressure to have visible impact. Stephanie, like you want to show that there's something that we are doing about it, but to have a rush into it, I think befits the purpose. For the internal work, that thought process, like let's appreciate where we're at and what we want the city to look like in the years to come. Yeah.
Thank you. Tony, do you still have a comment?
I do. So two challenging questions, and if you can be as transparent as possible, and I totally understand, Stephanie, if you can't say, if you can't answer it, because of what I'm going to ask is pretty challenging. What does the SLT actually feel about the equity framework? And is it possible for us or a cadre or selection of us to meet with the SLT, not during an equity board meeting, because I know this would be late for the SLT, but during the daytime of some week, 3 or 4 of us come in, meet with the SLT, have a conversation about the equity framework. Would also like to know what I think you mentioned the internal equity committee, what do they feel about the equity framework? And would it be possible to meet a number of them as well?
Yeah. I'm happy to answer that question. You know, while I certainly can't speak for individuals, I can speak for, you know, a reflection of what I gather from a whole. Very committed to wanting to advance this work, and on both sides.
Okay.
And wanting, actually making a request for the resource for us to be able to do it. Because part of it has just been the resource, and that's kind of why I started with that today, right? So there's definitely a overarching commitment to making sure that we keep talking about and moving and advancing this forward at both SLT and at the equity level. I'd love for that partnership for you guys to come to SLT or the internal equity committee. Both, you know, that's part of this, I'm gonna call it kind of this reset a little bit, you know, while we have made some strides, there's a lot more to make. And we're kind of at this pivotal, you know, place to, okay, now let's pick this up. You know, there's always gonna be some hurdle, right? There's always gonna be
Right.
some hurdle. But we have to, overcome some of those. So, yes, that's absolutely something that we can talk about, doing in the next days and weeks ahead. I want to come back to, a question that Shay answered or asked about, the 13 questions, and I don't have them pulled up, but I'll give you a sample of what I heard. There's one as it relates to council, the city council. What conversations or what impact, or what community, oh, here, I think it's number,
It's 4.
it's 4.
Yeah.
4, okay, 4 has been one that, staff have said, how has council's past contact involvement with marginalized stakeholder communities influenced, or how might it influence my decision-making process? Staff are going, how do I know what council, like, where would I even find, or who do I go ask, or how do I make sure that they're in, I would say, a little bit of the weeds of like, where do I even go to get this, I don't know what council's past involvement is, or I'm not even sure how I influence that. And so we're getting a little, and this is small sampling, right? Because I'm telling you, we need to advance this in a greater way throughout the organization. I'm talking the few people that have piloted in some way. I mean, I could pick out things, but I'd be kind of picking a couple different individuals. I think that I heard, and I like your approach of saying, what if we go use it in a couple spaces and staff come back here to you all and say, these were the challenges I had with this, and why do we, how did we not approach this, or maybe are we thinking too deep, or maybe those questions aren't pertainable to you for your particular scenario, right? And so I'm hearing all this, we've just gotta, I also, can I ask a question? I think when I'm gathering, and I don't want to assume, so I think I'm hearing that the equity board would like us not to necessarily start with only a couple questions, to start broad with education, but to not dwindle this down, from the place that you think it kind of captures a little bit of everything. Am I hearing that?
That's true, because even when I look at that question of the council, in my mind, I'm actually seeing the word city/council. City
Yeah.
council, so I'm looking at not the actual members of the council, but how has the city's interaction with the marginalized stakeholders, because very often there is, I mean, to me,
That
the
is true.
city council represents the city. So getting down in the nitty, like that word, like saying, oh, I don't know what the city council has done, so we can't do anything. But yet I hear feedback from people coming to talk to us like, well, we did all of this with the city, like the city came and talked to us, and yet now they're not listening to what we're saying. And that to me is the issue, right? Because there was conversation with these small group holders, and now their conversation is not being, we actually had an example of that like 2 months ago where that happened. And so that's what we're looking at. And so we asked, like, what are you doing to go back into and hearing or researching what past conversations occurred? Because the thing that makes people the most frustrated is we had this conversation 3 years ago, 5 years ago, and I said this and you're not listening to me. And what that then does is it causes people to disconnect and lose a sense of community. And so that question was really designed, it might not be the current council, but as a city, as a group, that's who they represent. What have we done? So you're right. I think when we look at this, and I said that we had already internalized so many of these questions, so we may not have been looking at like very specific determined wording as someone new looking at this. And so you said this is a tool. So sometimes when you're brand new using a tool, the way you use it is kind of awkwardly, versus if you're so familiar with the tool, you kind of know the ins and outs, and it becomes a snap to use and really get something good out of it, versus a newbie using the tool. And because of the slowness, the awkwardness, you might not use it to its maximum like,
Yeah, because it's easy to overthink that.
Yeah.
It's like it's community engagement,
Yeah.
right? What have we learned from past community engagement?
Yeah, and that's where maybe we knew exactly what that meant.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where our bias fell, because we didn't think about the fact that they may not know exactly what that meant.
And that's where I was asking about the training, because if they had given the tool, if they had ongoing conversation, because once you're given something, if you don't have more support in using a tool,
Right.
as a teacher, I don't give my students information that say, hey, kids, go ahead and continue with those, like, logarithms. I'm not gonna be here to answer any of your questions. There are gonna be mistakes. Some kids will succeed and some won't. So how do we make sure, like, is there someone to really, I'm not saying holding their hands, but guiding them through that?
Right.
But I think something around pilot testing the tool is what we're doing. And so I think the idea is that folks attempt to answer these questions and even note where they're having problems, right? It doesn't make sense to launch a full-scale training on a tool that needs refinement. So the pilot testing could help refine the tool and simplify it and do those things. So I think that's part of how to learn what to clean up the tool.
Yeah, I also think, like 6, if you scroll down a tiny bit, when I feel like we need to also just have some readily available answers for staff, because, 6 says, how am I convinced that reasonable efforts have been made in an individualized way to match the needs? When a staff member looks at that and they go, I'm not convinced, but what do I do with that? I'm using the tool, but I'm not convinced. So have we, that's the Chequity, not, what do we do like that, right?
Reasonable efforts, right? And in that sense, it's reasonable efforts have been made. You're not convinced that this is the best, but you're convinced that the effort has been made to meet the needs, which then goes back to question number 3 or 4 about what have we done in the past.
Yeah.
And access, and it's having that conversation with the community members. So focusing on am I convinced? I'm not convinced about anything right now.
Right.
But from what I've heard, like, I think that this is the best answer because it's reasonable.
I'm in an odd place, right? I have, I agree with both. And I think it has to do with me being white and, right? I mean, I'm like in a weird place and I don't even really want to talk because I feel like I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm going to say, I agree with you. I think it's too long. I have always thought that. And I'm wondering if that has to do with the way that I'm white. And so I'm just speaking right now. And that, because I agree with what's being said here too. I agree that these questions are really important. I agree that it's going to take a ton of learning to answer these questions. And that's where I'm kind of getting stuck, because there's so many things that people are not going to know, and they're going to have to sort it out or learn it or figure it out and then maybe help others learn it. Right?
Yeah.
And I do think that that's what we're talking about here. And that's why, for me, it's too long, because there's so much learning that's going to have to go on. On the other hand, all that learning has to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I recognize that I am in agreement that it's a pilot. I am in agreement that we need to do them all. I'm just trying to I think I'm really trying to say I'm empathetic, that because of my background, I also want to lower it to 5 when I can't figure out. I'm sitting here figuring out what would be cat, and I can't figure it out. See? So I'm trying to speak from a white person's perspective, literally, who is trying to see things with an equitable view.
we all see the world very different.
Yes.
Our experiences, right? So.
Right.
Thank you for that. And I think that was to your point too, to say, there needs to be a stance from leadership and an understanding, at a baseline that even gets the conversation started about why, right? Okay, Tony?
Yes, Christina
Oh,
first.
Yeah, please let Christina go first.
Christina?
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. A mí me gustaría decir que más que estar preocupados porque haya equidad y entender las religiones de otros, desde mi perspectiva, creo que deberíamos escucharlos.
I think, good afternoon. I think that, besides worrying about equity that much, I think that we should also think about religions and cultures, and we should focus on listening to them.
Escucharlos y conectar de verdad con las personas.
Listen and really get a deep connection with other people.
Creo que cuando hacemos eso, la comunicación siempre mejora.
When we do that, communication always gets better.
En mi caso, tuve una experiencia donde pregunté a una maestra sobre unos dados que jamás había visto en la vida.
I had an experience with a teacher, and she showed me a pair of die that I've never seen a type of die like that in my life before.
Pero ella, en vez de decirme dónde los compró o cómo eran los, no sé, dónde los podía conseguir, me contestó que eran muy caros.
And so instead of she telling me or explaining to me what type of die they were or where I could go get a pair, she said, "Oh, this die are too expensive for you."
Entonces supuse que ella estaba teniendo algo de, ¿cómo lo podríamos llamar? Prejuicio sobre mí.
And so I think she had some sort of, I don't know how to call it, misconception, maybe prejudice against me.
Pero no le dije nada y como yo ya conozco, pues tal vez estos temas de la equidad y ya estoy más envuelta en esto, pues simplemente lo ignoré porque no quise hacerlo más grande. Pero creo que ese es el detalle, que no estamos escuchando a las personas.
And, I let it go, perhaps just because I'm more involved in this equity thing now. And, I didn't want to make a huge deal out of it. But I think that that's what we're missing, that we are not listening to people when they're talking to us.
Solo quería compartirlo con ustedes y pensarlo más limpio, más puro. Cuando los niños nacen, cuando los niños juegan, cuando los niños crecen, ellos no tienen prejuicios. Tal vez debamos volver hacia allá.
I just wanted to share my experience with you, look at it on a healthier or cleaner approach. We have the example of children. When children are very young and they don't have any prejudices, they don't have any biases, maybe perhaps we should go to something like that and look at it from that point of view.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, for sharing that. Okay, and Tony's clapping.
Okay.
All right, Tony.
Thank you. Christina, thank you for sharing your experience. So I really, really appreciate you doing that. And I just want to say, Kelly, thank you for always, looking, putting yourself out there and, just kind of checking yourself on. So I really, really appreciate that. Thank you for having the courage to do so. What I'd like to talk about, or not just a question about, one is, has the SLT, because everything starts from the top. Has the SLT communicated in any way the framework?
To the organization as a whole?
Like from an organizational change management, what has been the SLT's message on the framework?
We have not.
Okay, all right. That's understandable. Okay. And so one thing I'd like to make a comment about, and I think we all have different feelings about the framework. If I'm sure you can detect there's some frustration. You can probably hear it in my voice that there's some frustration. And here's me coming from an experience as a Black man, and also from a professional who works for a software company that's worldwide. I have to do this on a daily basis. That's not racial. It's not a racial component. It's a cultural component. My audience is Europe, Middle East, Asia, as well as the Americas, as well as all the way down to South America. And so when I see the 13 questions, and my personal feeling is that it's not that hard. And so I'm just really just not grasping the understanding of the audience and everything that the city does is not just one racial component. It's a multiple as far as not just that, not just racial, but also socioeconomic. It's also physical ability. It's many different factors that it to me it just see like it's just not that hard to do. So I don't understand the kind of pushback on it. And the way I personally see the framework, and I'm sure my fellow colleagues probably see it the same way, or in different manners actually, that you can consider it a toolbox, like one set of tools, and you can take out the wrench, you can use the whole toolbox to build whatever you're building, a process, a product, a new initiative. So you can use every tool in the toolbox to build whatever you're building, whatever you want to build, or you could utilize only the tools that you need. And I feel that there's some questions that just in that it's just like it's not that hard. It's like it should be thought about in everything that the city does. Like questions 11 through 13, questions 1 through 3, and I think 5. That should be like even before a framework was actually made, that should have been thought about a long time. So I, I hope my frustration doesn't offend you. It's not, it's just, I just don't understand, Stephanie, and I'm not directing it at you. I just don't understand the pushback.
Yeah, thank you for that, and I didn't, I thank you for sharing the frustration, but no, I absolutely do not take it, in that, vein. I don't know that I would say pushback is the right word, and so maybe we need to talk through
Okay.
that a little bit.
Okay.
Because I want to be clear that there's not pushback to advance the equity framework. I think we wanted to do it in a meaningful way that people understand that it's a part of needing to change our culture. And if we just, I think maybe there's a bit of a disconnect. I'm gonna just spitball here and throw this out there as a idea that we want to make sure we're thoughtful and thorough in doing it, and then your perspective of saying it's not that hard to just answer these questions. Maybe that's where our roadblock is a little bit. So I want to be very clear. There's commitment to wanting to do this and build a culture change. We've actually referenced it against. We have what we call our salmon values. We have salmon values that are core values. They affectionately, we have an acronym, sustain trust, act with integrity, lead with respect, master communication, own action, and be engaged. And so what we've been saying organizationally that we need to say more of, we haven't taken it to the level we need to, is this framework, this should be a culture driver or change, very much like the salmon values, to where, we care less about people being able to recite them or chequity, which I'm gonna still learn this word from you. But to the place where you don't even need the questions, right?
Yes.
You just,
Right.
to the place you don't need the
That's
questions, you are living this.
Yes.
And so even with the salmon, before, yes, we had to use this acronym and talk about what every detail of it meant, even though it should be somewhat self-explanatory to sustain trust and to act with integrity. But we had to talk a lot about them and what every single thing meant to a level before we didn't have to look at the acronym anymore, and we could recite it, but more important than we've lost if we can recite it and we're not living it, right? So I think we have talked about similar approach for culture change, the way that we've embedded the salmon values. 4 years ago, salmon values were not even talked about in the city. Now we've added them to performance management. We've added them to the recruitment process. We did a staff training around them, and so I'm thinking through about that culture change with the salmon value is exactly the culture change that we need to do with the equity framework, right?
Okay.
So
Okay.
I hope that's, I hear you, and we've got to figure that out. Do I have all the answers? No, but we absolutely have to change that culture, and that's it. I just want to give kind of an analogy where that was even a little difficult to lift for a while.
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie. And I was just thinking and I was just kind of reading between the lines about, let's say, SLT, their thoughts and maybe possible feelings about this. Like if they haven't communicated it out, like, hey, this is a great thing, teams. We should implement this and you should go forward and utilize it in these manners and these ways. So I was just really kind of seeing that, okay, if SLT is not doing that, then one, why not? Two, my thought was, okay, so they must not see any value in it. So I was just kind of reading between the lines. So it sounds like from what you're saying, Stephanie, is that once, let's say, SLT as well as executive level management down below that, once they see how to utilize it, that it would be communicated out that this is something, it's kind of like the salmon values, right? Like the way you talked about that. Like we just don't know how to utilize it yet. We see that this is a valuable thing. This is great shiny new Porsche or Lamborghini that's sitting outside city headquarters. We just don't know how we're going to use it yet, and how we're going to make it more effective. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes,
Okay.
and making it available for people to test drive, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I'm just turning this way because I notice I'm like, and I want to make sure I'm reading the whole room. So was there?
Yeah, I wanted to just put out some challenges that might be able to help support this effort a little more. Because I think, in listening to Kelly especially, I think that a lot of people forget that equity is not just about race.
Yeah.
And if you don't understand the dimensions of equity, it's hard to go beyond race. And yes, it is a big part, but it is not necessarily the only part. There are 26 dimensions of equity that have to be addressed at some point. And making sure that that's understood, I think that would help people understand, especially the pilot groups, help them understand how they need to approach these questions, and how they can open their minds to the questions. Because let's just say, for example, if they looked at the treatment of veterans over the last, and how many times they come to council or the city to ask for certain things, maybe that would change their perspective on how they want to research that or discover what has already been said. Or even our seniors, because that's definitely something where I'm sure there have been tons of conversations, and people can actually track that information a little bit better. So maybe taking out, or I guess not taking out, but more so looking beyond race would help in helping people understand how to look at equity and what this framework is designed to address. And then on the other part, I would challenge our board to maybe take a look at the framework again. Because to Lorna's point, we did build that language at a time when equity was such a high priority and such a touchy subject, and everyone was so very sensitive about it, that maybe the verbiage was designed in what we were automatically seeing, and not necessarily where Kelly could understand how it would work, or someone who hasn't always used equity in their thought process would understand it. And I think that it's fair that we maybe take another look and say, hey, maybe there's a question that we might not need, because even Tony called out the questions and not all of them were included. And that says something to me. And of course, yes, this is close to my heart and I wouldn't want to shorten it. But on the same token, to your point, people have to be guided in and you have to give them a way to accept the information. And if we're determined not to cut them, we at least need to make sure that we can help them understand how to use them. And maybe that's as simple as making sure they know what the dimensions are, or maybe it's as simple as making sure we change some verbiage, or making sure that we simplify those questions to where it doesn't seem daunting. And typically, when you give people the opportunity to take that information in digestively, then they are less likely to say, I can't answer this question, or I don't know what this means. So hopefully that's not asking too much, but I do think that maybe it's a point where we could all put some contributions in that might help.
Thank you. I have all kinds of, thought, and you have to look at your team members here too, right? I'm gonna go back to one of the questions around what would this team like to see, advance in a great way over the next year, right? Tony expressed some frustration that it might not be that hard. We haven't actually gone at it as much as we could have internally, and resources have been a part of that. There's a space to design what that training for staff looks like, to look back at the questions. I want to make sure that we're all remember the right and the left hand, or the rowing in the right direction. I want to know, as we look internally, what this group who represents this community is expecting happens internally over the next, Lorna said, I don't know about 6 months, but a year or more. It's ongoing. It's never done, right? Yeah.
So we're not expecting perfection, but
Good.
to me, this is the learning process.
Mhm.
And so even, there are 13 questions, but I think in my mind, if you skip a question because it doesn't apply, who cares? As
Yeah.
Tony was saying, it's a toolbox.
Yeah.
So to me, the focus on the number of questions is not actually relevant at all. That you answer the questions you can. If you don't understand, if it doesn't apply, you skip it. I don't use every single tool in my toolbox. I don't use single thing they give me in Microsoft Word, even though they're beautiful. So you use what you can, but if someone comes back to you and says, hey, this was there, did you do that? You're like, oh. And then you start reflecting and building and learning, this is where I could have learned or incorporated that in my thinking. And that helps put it in there. But I think, to me, the questions give you it's what the word is, a framework. It's like a big umbrella. I'm holding it over my head, and guess what? There are parts of the umbrella I'm not standing under. They're not applying to me. But it's the whole thing. It's there. You use what is relevant at that time. So I think it's the thinking of what people are and how they're using it needs to be revisited.
Right.
They're making it bigger than it actually is, and maybe take a stab at it. And that's where, again, I said, hey, take a stab at it, answer what you can, come to us and let us help you understand what we're expecting you to do. And I don't think any of us are expecting them to do something that's super difficult. We're expecting them to
They're not essay questions.
Yeah, we're not expecting you to deep dive into the archives and history of Issaquah and all of that. We're not expecting that, but I think that it's fair to say that we are expecting you to attempt to do it. And even if you can't answer all the questions, that's okay, because we can help you answer those questions. And that's where I said, once you've started, then come to us and let us take a look at what you've come up with. I think this board is very capable of providing solutions and providing insight that people don't always think about.
Sure.
And we might not even know the answer.
Right,
It might not be answered within that 6 months, and then someone's gonna come and say, hey, you didn't do this. You're like, oh, yeah, you reflect. So it's the openness to learn.
Yeah, I want to say something too. I want to make sure that you all know our, and this is just ownership, okay? Ownership that we haven't piloted as much as even we should maybe having this big conversation. Part of it is just not even having had the space to go out and have all those conversations and have people trying. So I'm mentioning a couple of people and projects. It is not as many voices as I need to bring back and share using it. So I just want to own that we're at a space to do that in a greater way. And it hasn't been done as much as it could have been over this last year. And I think you need to know that.
And I hope I hope that that it's actually communicated that it's okay to fail at this, right? Because you're going to be building something. You're going to make mistakes, like what Christina mentioned. Like you're going to be going through this process of the framework and just going to just totally forget about a religious component. Or as Shay's point, you're going to forget about, well, what about Tony and his fellow veterans in Issaquah? Like you're just going to forget about those things, but at least make an attempt. At least try. At least try.
Because you've thought of more than you did before, right?
Yeah.
And as a staff member, I'm just going to jump in that even just everyone starting somewhere, I think even this conversation here was just so valuable tonight that even just sharing the recording, so then others can hear the input and how highly capable the equity board is, and providing the tool, I think even that could be just a good starting point. Right?
For sure.
Because that was great conversation here tonight. Great input.
So because I am committed to helping advance this in a great way, I'm gonna come more often just to be in the room and here to the extent that I have availability to do that. So at least for the next couple of meetings, I want to make sure that if I'm helping to facilitate things internally in a greater whole, I want to make sure that I'm paying close attention to what you're hearing from other city staff, what's on the agenda, how you even heard tonight with David talking, and Monica had one experience and I had one experience and David has one experience, and there's an opportunity here to kind of bring this together. Part of that is just hearing, right? And being in the room to have those conversations to help shape that a bit. So I am going to try to see you all a bit more in the months ahead. Okay. Thank you for the conversation. I agree. It was very a good one to have, and I'm really hopeful that we can all work together to keep this moving, right? Keep the conversation going. Okay.
And I hope that we can develop a timeline to keep this going.
Yeah.
Because I think timelines make it valuable. When you say, hey, I want to get this accomplished by the end of the year, people tend to move in a way that allows them to get there. So I know it can't happen tomorrow, but I absolutely think we should aim for time.
Yeah, agreed. And that's kind of where my question around what would success look like for you guys at a certain interval, right? That you've, heard from, at least a handful of people who have piloted this and tried it or have had the conversation at SLT. I'm going to take feedback away tonight and try to shape something that I can share forward.
I have some thoughts on this. Just less on how to, because again, I have a different perspective. I see some of these as you have to build significantly. Like, for example, the 26 yes, right.
Yeah.
Just to identify them and to figure out how our relationship as a city is significant work. I mean, I don't think there is a shared collective view on how we work with veterans in Issaquah, right? So right there. So you have a couple of pilots, whatever it is, and you get some shared understanding of the questions that need a shared understanding, and then a shared understanding of both the output and of the question, right? And that, to me, success is you have X number of groups who have a shared understanding of what these questions are asking them to output and do, literally, because that's the work.
Sure. And that's part of why I said we just need to even have those conversations with the staff at a foundational level, right? Around some of that. So,
yes.
thank you for that. Okay. Well, it's 8:09 and I mean, important stuff. We could probably keep talking about it longer and longer, right? So thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be here. Yeah, and thank you guys for the great work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Okay.
Okay. And so now we're going to move on to staff report from Monica.
Thank you, board members. I have a couple of updates for you from Mayor, City Council, and then other related updates. First of all, Mayor Polly will join us at the next equity meeting, which is actually next week. As you, just a reminder for all of you, as we are just having a back-to-back meeting because we had to reschedule the meeting earlier in the month due to a religious holiday. That's just one brief update, and with that I was trying to also share my screen to draw your attention to our schedule and work plan, but I am having a hard time with that. Give me just a moment. I was so proud of myself with sharing tonight, and now I am at the end, keeping you longer than I want to. Okay, so just really quick, giving you a sneak peek at next week's meeting. We are going to be welcoming new board members. We have tentatively 2 new board members, 1 youth and 1 adult joining us. I'm saying tentative because we have a hard time connecting with the youth member. So surprise, 1 or 2 members coming next week. Unfortunately with that, we are having a goodbye and transitioning out board member Alyssa. It's her last meeting today. She's not with us. Actually, I just got a note from her that her work ended up being extended. So she just finished work a few minutes ago. I'm hoping that we can find a way to say goodbyes and thank her for the amazing work that she did. But with that, as I mentioned, Mayor Polly will come and visit. We'll have capital improvement plan coming back to the CIP for short. And that is, if you remember, first conversations you had at that joint meeting with the other 4 boards and commissions back in February. Then you had some other information that was shared with you via email. So that's coming back to you next week. And then Pretty, Alyssa, and I have been working on a small subcommittee on the reporting bias work plan. So we are not ready yet for too large of a conversation, but we are hoping to have it a brief update to you. And so we hope that Alyssa will continue at least as a resident community member, part of that subcommittee until that work is going to be done. And then we also have a placeholder for human resources. As Stephanie said, she's going to be back here. Just drawing your attention to, as I promised to you earlier in the year, I will keep this updated. It's the schedule for the year with work plan items. They change often from week to week. So every month I'll make sure that I put the most updated one in your packet. And just a quick note about the packet that I learned recently, actually not long ago. When I send you the email that the agenda has been published, if you remember, there are always 2 links. There's a PDF and there's an HTML. I just discovered not long ago that the HTML is just so handy because if you click on that, you can scroll on the agenda and actually you have links to each of the attachments. So if you knew, and this is all news, I apologize. I just not long ago discovered it and I find it very like, oh, this is the best thing since sliced bread. So I just thought I would share it. So that's not part of the news. I'm gonna go back to just a few other couple of updates for 2 minutes. I know we are over time tonight, and I know you're always interested in all human services related things. So recently, a few weeks ago, City Council approved $200,000 in an emergency funding for rental assistance, and that was really to bridge the gap for continued need that we see. So that was approved. Our staff, we are working and we finalized actually the contracts for that. And so we are excited about that. Also, just recently on Monday, I provided an update and we had a great conversation with City Council regarding the emergency housing pilot project in collaboration with Motel 6. As you may recall, we provided some information to you on that. Because we had difficulties finding the service provider to take on the management for that program, we sought approval from City Council to allow us to utilize the funds for those operations to bring in limited term positions. And actually, because we are really committed to that work to hire limited term positions, speaking of HR, we are working with them, keeping them busy for sure. So we are currently in that process, and I'm happy to report that City Council was more than welcoming of that idea. We are going back in mid-May just for the formal approval, but I don't foresee any huge changes. They were very, very supportive of that. And last but not least, still equity and human services related, we began a conversation with City Council on adding new behavioral health coordinators to the existing 2 staff that we have for homeless outreach and behavioral coordinators, just for the increased capacity. Again, we will continue that conversation with City Council in May, and so we'll see where that goes. But we are hopeful and excited about all the amazing work and many, many changes. So those are just brief updates for you from Mayor, City Council. And we talked a little bit about transition. So yes, we'll see everyone next week, but be prepared to welcome a new member or 2 new members.
I do have a question. Will we be talking about Juneteenth at the next week's meeting, or will that be a separate group that you'll be emailing about?
It's actually a little bit of both. We can certainly talk about Juneteenth at the meeting also, yes. And then I was hoping to also create a subcommittee to see what we'll do about Juneteenth. And I also wanted to share, but again, it's, I think, a larger conversation. So hopefully maybe we can take some time next week to wanted to share some feedback that we received from some community members regarding some of the proclamations that we do as a city, some of the events and we do. And so I think, yes, we would need to have a conversation, which I think it might be also helpful to have it at the board level, not just committee level. So yes, let's talk about it next week, if that's okay. Yeah. Okay, that concludes. And I think,
Okay, are there any other businesses or announcements? I think you already covered that.
yes, I know.
And okay, so the next meeting is currently scheduled for May 3rd, 2023, and this ends our meeting today.
8:17. Thank you.
8:17, yay!
I'm looking at
Good.
There's people classes.
Thank you for being so gracious.